Catherine, Mark, and their friend Dylan had planned the trip for weeks, a camping weekend deep in the heart of Oregon's Cascade Range. Catherine had been eager for a break from her office job, Mark wanted to escape the endless notifications on his phone, and Dylan, the group's adventurer, simply craved the wilderness. Their destination was a secluded spot Dylan had found on an obscure hiking forum. No cell service, no crowds, just us and nature, he had promised, spreading out a hand-drawn map on Catherine's kitchen counter weeks earlier. Friday evening, they arrived just before sunset. The dense evergreens loomed overhead as they set up camp by a shallow creek. Catherine loved the quiet, the kind of stillness that felt impossible in the city. But as the last light faded, that silence began to feel oppressive, as though the forest were listening. Dylan was the first to notice something strange. "Did you see that?" he asked, pointing across the creek. Catherine followed his gaze but saw only the dense wall of trees. "What was it?" Mark asked, adjusting his headlamp. "Thought I saw movement," Dylan muttered. "Probably a deer." But Catherine wasn't so sure. The shadows across the creek seemed darker, heavier somehow, as though they were hiding something. That night, they sat around the fire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. But the forest seemed to close in on them, and every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch made Catherine jump. She tried to laugh it off, but the unease wouldn't leave. As the fire dwindled, they decided to call it a night. But in the tent, Catherine couldn't sleep. The usual symphony of nocturnal animals, crickets, owls, the occasional distant coyote, was absent. The silence was absolute. Hours passed. Catherine lay still, staring at the faint outline of the tent's ceiling. Then she heard it, a faint, deliberate crunch of footsteps outside. "Dylan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No," he murmured from his sleeping bag. "I thought that was you." Mark sat up, his silhouette rigid. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. But then, the tent zipper moved, just an inch. They froze, hearts pounding, as the zipper slid down another inch, and a cold draft seeped in. "Who's there?" Dylan finally barked, his voice cutting through the quiet. The zipper stopped, and the footsteps retreated into the forest. They sat in stunned silence until dawn, none of them daring to open the tent or even speak. When daylight finally arrived, they unzipped the tent cautiously. The ground outside was undisturbed, no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. "Let's pack up and go," Catherine said, her voice tight. But as they turned to gather their things, they noticed something chilling. On the side of the tent, written in smeared ash, were the words, "Stay quiet." The ash-written message froze them in place. For a moment, none of them spoke. It wasn't just fear, it was disbelief, as though their minds were trying to reject what their eyes were seeing. "Okay," Mark said finally, his voice barely audible. "We need to leave. Now." They broke camp in silence, hands trembling as they stuffed their gear into backpacks. The usual camaraderie that accompanied their trips was gone, replaced by an oppressive weight. The forest, once beautiful, now felt claustrophobic. Dylan led the way, map in hand, but his confidence from the previous day was absent. He stopped every few minutes, turning in small circles as if the trail didn't match what he remembered. "It's just the light," Dylan said, trying to sound convincing. "Everything looks different in the morning." Catherine wasn't so sure. The path, which had been clear the day before, seemed narrower, overgrown, as if the forest itself were shifting. Hours passed, but the landmarks Dylan had described, an old fallen tree, a clearing with wildflowers, never appeared. Instead, the woods grew denser, the sunlight weaker. Mark kept checking his phone, even though they knew there was no service. "We should have hit the main trail by now," Dylan admitted, finally stopping to rest. His voice was edged with frustration and fear. "So we're lost," Catherine said, her tone sharper than she intended. "Not lost," Dylan shot back, though he didn't meet her eyes. We just need to retrace our steps. Steps to where? Mark snapped. Back to the creek where someone, or something, was watching us. The argument was cut short by the sound of wood splitting. It was distant but distinct, like a tree being felled. The three of them turned in unison, staring in the direction of the noise. Could be a hiker, Dylan suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Or someone who doesn't want us here, Catherine muttered. They decided to keep moving, heading downhill in hopes of finding the main trail or a road. But as the hours stretched on, their pace slowed. They were running low on water, and fatigue was setting in. The woods felt endless, oppressive. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they stumbled upon something unexpected, a small, dilapidated cabin. It was barely standing, with a sagging roof and moss-covered walls. A rusted axe was embedded in a stump outside, and the windows were boarded up. Maybe there's a map or supplies inside, Dylan suggested, though he sounded unsure. Or maybe it's a bad idea, Catherine countered. Mark hesitated but nodded toward the cabin. We're losing daylight. We need to figure out where we are. Reluctantly, they approached. The door creaked open at a touch, revealing a room filled with dust and decay. A table in the center was covered in old, yellowed maps. On the wall hung Polaroids, dozens of them, pinned in neat rows. Mark stepped closer, squinting at the photos. His breath caught. The pictures showed campers, smiling groups like theirs, posing with backpacks and tents. But as the rows continued, the smiles faded. The last photo in each set was different, the same people, but now sitting silently, staring at the camera, their faces blank. This isn't right, Catherine whispered, backing toward the door. Dylan turned, pointing to one of the maps. Wait, this shows a road nearby, he said, tracing a faint line with his finger. We're close. We can make it before dark. But Catherine's attention was fixed on the Polaroids. In the final row, she recognized something chilling, a photo of their campsite from the night before, the three of them sitting around the fire. We have to leave, she said urgently, pulling on Dylan's arm. The sound of footsteps outside froze them. Not the light, random steps of an animal, but deliberate, heavy boots. Someone was circling the cabin. The footsteps stopped at the door. The three of them stood frozen, barely daring to breathe. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint creak of the cabin's walls. Mark motioned for them to stay quiet as he reached for the rusted axe outside the cabin. Slowly, he slid it from the stump. His hands shook, the metal colder than he expected. The door handle rattled. Who's there? Mark called, his voice breaking. No response. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the dim light. It wasn't a stranger, it was an older man, maybe in his late 60s, with a scruffy beard and a flannel shirt. He held a hunting rifle loosely in one hand. What are you doing here? The man asked, his voice low and gravelly. We're lost, Dylan blurted out, stepping forward with his hands raised. We were camping, and we... I didn't ask for your life story, the man interrupted, narrowing his eyes. He looked past Dylan to the Polaroids on the wall, his expression darkening. You shouldn't have come here, the man said after a long pause. What do you mean? Catherine asked, her voice trembling. The man exhaled sharply, lowering the rifle slightly. This place. It ain't safe. Especially for people like you who don't know the rules. Rules? Mark asked, gripping the axe tightly. Rule 1, the man said, ignoring Mark's tone. Never stay past sunset. Rule 2, don't go looking where you don't belong. He gestured to the Polaroids. And Rule 3, stay quiet. The forest doesn't like noise. That's ridiculous, Dylan snapped. We're leaving. Just tell us how to get to the road. The man stepped aside, pointing a weathered finger to the map on the table. Take the ridge trail, he said. Keep moving. Don't stop, no matter what you hear. You might make it. Might? Catherine asked, panic creeping into her voice. The man met her gaze but didn't answer. Instead, he stepped outside, scanning the forest. I'll give you a head start, he said over his shoulder. But if I were you, I wouldn't waste it. Without another word, he disappeared into the trees. They didn't question him. Within minutes, they were following the ridge trail, marked faintly by stones and broken branches. The sun was sinking fast, the forest darkening around them. Do you think he's messing with us? Dylan whispered as they hiked. I don't care, Catherine said. If there's a road, we'll find it. Mark glanced behind them, his grip still tight on the axe. He thought he saw movement in the trees, shadows shifting unnaturally. Just keep moving, he said. The quiet grew heavier as they climbed the ridge. Even their footsteps felt muffled, as though the forest were swallowing every sound. Then, from somewhere in the distance, a low, rhythmic knocking began. 3 knocks, followed by silence. Then 3 more. What is that? Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible. No idea, Dylan said, speeding up. The knocking grew louder, closer. It wasn't coming from one direction, it surrounded them, echoing through the trees. Run, Mark said. They sprinted up the trail, breathless and terrified. The knocking grew frantic, as though chasing them. But no matter how far they ran, the sound stayed with them. Finally, they reached a clearing. In the fading light, they could see a narrow dirt road cutting through the trees below. Relief washed over them. We made it, Catherine gasped. But as they descended toward the road, Dylan stopped. Where's Mark? They turned, realizing he was no longer with them. Mark! Catherine shouted, breaking the man's first rule. The knocking stopped. A single scream pierced the silence, sharp and gut-wrenching. It was Mark's voice. Catherine grabbed Dylan's arm. We have to go back. No, Dylan said, his voice firm. We don't. We get to the road, we find help, and we come back with more people. We can't do this alone. Catherine hesitated, tears streaming down her face. But she knew Dylan was right. They reached the road as the last light disappeared. Behind them, the forest loomed, silent once again. And then, just as they thought they were safe, they saw it, a Polaroid, pinned to a tree by the road. It was still fresh, the ink not fully dried. The photo showed Mark, sitting alone in the cabin, staring blankly at the camera. Dylan yanked the Polaroid from the tree, his hands trembling. Catherine stared at it in disbelief, her heart pounding. This doesn't make sense, she whispered. How could this? Let's go, Dylan interrupted, his voice cold and decisive. We'll call the Rangers. Let them deal with this. But deep down, they both knew, no ranger was going to explain what they'd seen. They followed the road in silence, the forest closing in on either side. The moon was barely visible through the thick canopy. After an hour, headlights appeared in the distance. Catherine waved frantically, and the car, a beat-up pickup, slowed to a stop. Inside was an older woman, her face lined with years of hard work. You kids all right? She asked, rolling down the window. Please, Dylan said, his voice shaking. We need to get to the nearest town. The woman nodded, gesturing for them to climb into the truck bed. Catherine hesitated, glancing back at the dark forest. She thought she saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching. Get in, Dylan urged. They climbed in, and the truck rumbled down the road. At the ranger station in the nearest town, they told their story to an officer named Carter. He listened intently, his expression unreadable. This isn't the first time I've heard about strange things in those woods, Carter said finally. But I've never seen proof like this. He held up the Polaroid of Mark. Can you send a search team? Catherine asked. We'll do our best, Carter replied. But it's a big forest. And if what you're saying is true? He trailed off, shaking his head. What? Dylan pressed. Carter hesitated, then leaned forward. There's a reason we don't advertise that area to tourists. People go missing out there. Sometimes we find their camps, their cars. But we don't find them. Why don't you shut it down? Catherine demanded. Because there's nothing to shut down, Carter said. No evidence. Just stories. Days passed with no word about Mark. Catherine and Dylan stayed in town, waiting for news. They didn't sleep much, haunted by guilt and the unknown. On the third day, a ranger arrived at their motel. We found your friend's backpack, he said. And Mark? Catherine asked, her voice trembling. The ranger shook his head. No sign of him. They followed the ranger to the forest's edge, where Mark's backpack lay at the start of a trail. Inside were his belongings, untouched. But something was missing, the axe. What does this mean? Dylan asked, looking at the ranger. I don't know, the ranger admitted. But if you're smart, you'll leave this place and never come back. Months later, Catherine and Dylan tried to move on, but the events of that weekend stayed with them. They never returned to the forest, never spoke of it to anyone outside that town. But sometimes, late at night, Catherine would dream of Mark. In the dreams, he was sitting in that cabin, staring at the camera, his face blank. And always, in the background, she heard the knocking. Ryan adjusted his backpack and wiped sweat from his forehead. The August sun was relentless, casting long shadows over the dense forest. He and his two best friends, Megan and James, were halfway through their planned 3-day camping trip in Bear Ridge National Forest, a trip that had been Megan's idea. It's supposed to be beautiful and remote, she'd said while convincing them, her eyes bright with excitement. A chance to disconnect and enjoy nature. But now, as they trudged along the narrow trail, Ryan wasn't so sure. The path was overgrown, the markers faded, and the map they'd printed was turning out to be less accurate than they'd hoped. We're still on the right track, Megan said confidently, though her voice lacked conviction. She pointed at the faint trail ahead. We'd better be, James muttered, glancing at his phone's battery indicator. No signal, and I've got 10% left. Relax, Megan replied, though she didn't look back. We'll set up camp at Black Pine Lake tonight. It's only a couple of miles away. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the trail seemed to disappear entirely. The three of them stood at the edge of a steep ravine, the map proving useless. This isn't right, Ryan said, looking around. Megan frowned. It has to be. Maybe the trail shifted. Let's just. No, James interrupted. We need to backtrack. We don't even know if we're heading toward the lake anymore. We'll lose daylight, Megan argued. And we'll lose ourselves if we keep guessing, Ryan said, siding with James. We should find somewhere safe to camp for the night and figure this out tomorrow. Reluctantly, Megan agreed. They found a small clearing near the ravine, just big enough for their tent. As the darkness enveloped the forest, they lit a small fire and ate the last of their packed sandwiches. The tension from earlier lingered. Megan was unusually quiet, James kept fiddling with his near-dead phone, and Ryan couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that they weren't as alone as they thought. Do you hear that? Megan asked suddenly, breaking the silence. The three of them stopped talking, listening intently. Faintly, in the distance, came the sound of water rushing. Maybe it's the creek that leads to the lake, Megan said, her earlier confidence returning. Or just a stream, James countered. It's something, Megan insisted. If we follow it, it could lead us back to the trail. Ryan sighed. We can check it out tomorrow when there's light. For now, we need rest. Reluctantly, they crawled into the tent. But sleep came slowly, the sounds of the forest amplified in the quiet. When Ryan woke up, the fire had burned out, and the morning sun was just beginning to filter through the trees. James was sitting outside the tent, staring into the distance. "What's up?" Ryan asked, stepping out. James motioned toward the ravine. "There's a path down there. I saw it when the light came up." Ryan squinted, and sure enough, he could make out what looked like an old, overgrown trail winding down the slope. "Should we wake Megan?" James shook his head. "Let's check it out first. No need to drag her out if it's a dead end." They descended the ravine carefully, the loose dirt making the footing treacherous. At the bottom, the trail became clearer, though it was unlike the ones they'd been on before, narrower, older, almost as if it hadn't been used in years. "Think this is part of the park?" James asked. "Maybe," Ryan said, though he wasn't convinced. They followed the trail for what felt like a quarter of a mile before stumbling upon something unexpected. An old wooden sign, partially collapsed, with faded lettering that read, "Marlin Creek Trailhead, established 1974. "What the hell?" James muttered. "That's not on the map." Ryan studied the sign. This trail must have been abandoned. Maybe it used to connect to the main trails before they rerouted everything. So where does it go? Before Ryan could answer, a voice called from the ridge above. "Ryan." "James? Where are you?" It was Megan. "We're down here." Ryan shouted back, his voice echoing through the trees. Megan appeared at the top of the ravine, looking annoyed. "Why didn't you wake me? What is this?" "An old trail," James said, pointing to the sign. "We think it might lead somewhere useful." "Or nowhere at all," Megan said. "We should stick to finding the lake." Ryan hesitated. The trail intrigued him, it felt like they'd stumbled onto something forgotten. But Megan was right, it might lead to nothing. "What do you want to do?" Ryan asked, looking at her. Megan folded her arms, glancing down the overgrown path. "We came to explore, didn't we?" she said with a faint smile. And with that, the three of them stepped onto the forgotten trail, unaware of what they were about to find. The trail narrowed as they pushed further, the dense undergrowth clawing at their legs. The air felt cooler here, heavy with the scent of moss and damp earth. "This doesn't look like it's been used in decades," Megan muttered, brushing away a spiderweb. "Or maybe they just wanted people to think that," James said, his voice tinged with unease. Ryan stopped abruptly. "Wait. Do you hear that?" They all froze. The faint sound of rushing water came from somewhere ahead. "Could be the creek," Megan said, her voice lifting with hope. "Let's hope it's more than a puddle," James added. The three followed the sound, and soon, the trail opened into a small clearing. A narrow stream ran through the middle, its water shimmering in the dappled sunlight. On the far side, half hidden by bushes, stood the crumbling remains of a wooden cabin. "No way," Megan whispered, stepping closer. The cabin was old, its roof partially caved in, the door hanging off its hinges. Yet something about it felt oddly preserved, as if it had been left behind in a hurry. "This must have been part of the original trail," Ryan said, eyeing the structure. "Whoever built this didn't plan to leave," James added, pointing to a rusted water pump near the stream. "Looks like they were living off the land." Megan moved toward the cabin, her curiosity outweighing her caution. "Let's check it out." "Maybe we shouldn't," Ryan said, his gut telling him something felt off. But Megan was already at the door. She pushed it open, and it creaked loudly, revealing a dim interior. The cabin was a single room. A dusty table stood in the center, flanked by two broken chairs. A cot leaned against the far wall, its mattress long decayed. What caught their attention, though, was a stack of old, yellowed notebooks piled on the table. "Whoa," James said, picking one up. The cover was labeled in faded pencil, "Marlin Creek Logbook, 1982. Ryan opened another notebook. The pages were filled with neat, slanted handwriting, chronicling daily activities, fishing, foraging, weather observations. "It's like a journal," he said, flipping through the pages. "Whoever wrote this must have been the last person to use the cabin," Megan said, her fingers running over the dusty surface of the table. James frowned, holding up a different notebook. "Not the last. Look at this." Ryan and Megan leaned in. The pages were covered in frantic scribbles, diagrams, and notes, all written in shaky handwriting. Words like "no escape," "can't trust them," and "followed me" stood out. "What the hell happened here?" Megan asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan closed the notebook and set it down. "We should go. This place. It's not right." But before they could leave, a faint noise stopped them in their tracks. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed from somewhere outside. They froze, exchanging panicked glances. "Someone's out there," James whispered. Ryan motioned for them to stay quiet, then crept toward the window. He peered out but saw nothing but trees and shifting shadows. "Could have been an animal," he said, trying to convince himself. "Let's not wait to find out," Megan said, already moving toward the door. They hurried outside, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the clearing. The footsteps had stopped, but the uneasy feeling hadn't. "We need to get back to the main trail," Ryan said. "Which way?" Megan asked, her voice rising in panic. Ryan looked around, trying to remember the path they'd taken. But the forest seemed different now, as if the trees had shifted. I don't know," he admitted. James cursed under his breath. "Great. We're lost. Again." A low rustling sound came from the bushes nearby. All three of them spun around, their breaths caught in their throats. "Probably just a raccoon," Megan said, though her voice was shaky. "Or not," James muttered. Ryan took a step forward, his eyes scanning the bushes. He saw movement, a quick flash of something dark, but it was gone before he could make it out. "Let's go," he said firmly. They turned back toward the trail they thought they'd come from, moving quickly now. The forest felt oppressive, the air growing colder as the sun began to dip below the horizon. After what felt like hours, they finally stumbled upon a familiar marker, a carved tree they'd passed earlier. Relief washed over them. "This way," Ryan said, leading the group. They found their original campsite just as darkness fell, the remnants of their fire still visible. "No more exploring," James said, dropping his pack. "Tomorrow, we're out of here." For once, Megan didn't argue. As they settled in for the night, none of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest was silent, unnervingly so, as if holding its breath. And in the morning, when they awoke, they found the notebooks neatly stacked outside their tent. Ryan stared at the stack of notebooks outside their tent, his chest tightening. "Did one of you move these?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. Megan and James emerged groggily from the tent. Megan's eyes widened when she saw the books. "What the?" "No. We left them in the cabin." James looked pale. "Someone followed us." Ryan crouched down to examine the books. They were arranged neatly, almost deliberately. The top notebook was open, its pages fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. Written across the page, in the same shaky handwriting as before, was a single sentence: "You should not have come here." "Okay, we're leaving," James said, backing away. "No arguments," Ryan agreed, already packing his gear. Megan hesitated, glancing toward the forest. "What if we're just scaring ourselves? Maybe we left them outside without realizing it." Ryan shot her a sharp look. "You really think that's what happened?" She didn't answer. They packed up quickly and set off toward the main trail, retracing their steps from the previous day. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the sounds of birds and insects muted. As they walked, James kept glancing over his shoulder. Do you think someone's following us? Let's just focus on getting back to the car, Ryan said, though he couldn't stop himself from checking behind them too. The uneasy silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of their boots crunching on the dirt path. After about an hour, they reached a familiar fork in the trail. Relief began to creep in as Ryan recognized the carved marker indicating the route back to the parking lot. We're close, he said. But as they started down the path, Megan suddenly stopped. Wait. What now? James asked, exasperated. She pointed to the ground. There, in the dirt, were fresh footprints, large and heavy, heading in the same direction they were. Someone else has been through here, she said. Or is still ahead of us, James added grimly. Ryan felt his stomach knot. Let's keep moving. Quickly. The trail became steeper as it wound down toward the parking area. The trees thinned slightly, and Ryan began to feel a glimmer of hope. We'll be out of here in no time, he said, trying to reassure the group, and himself. But as they rounded the final bend, the hope drained from him. The parking lot was empty, except for their car. Where is everyone? Megan asked. There should have been other hikers, James said, his voice shaking. Ryan scanned the area, his eyes darting to the edge of the forest. There was no sign of movement, no sound of engines, no other vehicles. Let's just get in the car and go, he said firmly. They rushed to the car, throwing their packs into the trunk. Ryan slid into the driver's seat, the others piling in behind him. As he started the engine, something caught his eye in the rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the forest, partially obscured by shadows, was a figure. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. Ryan's hands tightened on the wheel. Don't look back, he said, his voice steady but urgent. What? Why? Megan began, but James interrupted her. Just go, man. Ryan didn't wait. He slammed the car into reverse, then onto the narrow dirt road leading out of the lot. The figure grew smaller in the mirror as they sped away, until it finally disappeared into the trees. They didn't speak much on the drive back to town, the tension heavy in the car. When they finally reached civilization, Ryan pulled into the first gas station they found. James got out to stretch, but Ryan stayed in the car, gripping the wheel tightly. Megan broke the silence. What do you think that was? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan shook his head. I don't know. And I don't want to. James returned, holding something in his hand. Guys. He held up one of the notebooks. It was sitting on the back seat when they'd stopped. No one spoke. Ryan started the car again, and they drove home in silence, the forest a distant but lingering shadow in their minds. The notebook sat on the back seat, silent and accusing. Megan, James, and Ryan stared at it as though it might move or speak. No way, James muttered, his voice cracking. No one brought that. I know we didn't. It's not possible, Megan whispered, though she was trembling. Ryan took a deep breath and opened the door. I'll get rid of it. Wait. Megan grabbed his arm. What if? What? Ryan snapped. What if it's cursed? Haunted? We can't keep it. But her hesitation gave him pause. Instead of tossing it immediately, he pulled the notebook closer and opened it. The pages were blank. What? Ryan flipped through rapidly, his heart pounding. Each page was clean, untouched by the frantic scribbles they'd seen before. This doesn't make sense, Megan whispered, leaning closer. Just burn it, James said, his voice firm. Whatever's going on, I don't want it following us home. Ryan hesitated for a moment but then nodded. He grabbed a lighter from the glove box, stepped out of the car, and lit the corner of the notebook. The dry pages caught quickly, curling and blackening in the flame. They watched in silence as the book disintegrated into ash on the side of the road. "It's done," Ryan said, his voice flat. The drive home was uneventful. The tension lingered, but nothing strange happened. No shadows appeared in the mirror, no mysterious sounds followed them. They dropped Megan and James off at their respective homes before Ryan finally pulled into his own driveway. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street. As Ryan got out of the car and grabbed his bag, he glanced at the back seat. Empty. He let out a sigh of relief. Inside, his house was quiet. He tossed his bag onto the couch and headed to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. The cold drink steadied him, and he leaned against the counter, staring out the window at the fading daylight. Just a weird trip, he told himself. Nothing more. But as he turned to leave the kitchen, he froze. On the dining table, where nothing had been before, sat a single, yellowed notebook. He approached it slowly, his heart pounding. The cover was blank, but when he flipped it open, the first page bore a single sentence in neat, slanted handwriting. "You can't escape the forest." Ryan didn't sleep that night. The next day, he called Megan and James, but neither answered. He drove to Megan's house, only to find her car still in the driveway and her phone on the kitchen counter, but no sign of her. James's apartment was the same, door unlocked, lights on, but no one inside. Ryan knew he should call the police, but what could he tell them? That his friends had vanished, and he was being haunted by a forest that wouldn't let go. Instead, he drove back to the forest. Back to Marlin Creek. And as he stepped onto the trail once more, the silence of the trees welcomed him. This time, there was no turning back.